Recently began renting my first house with 3 other roommates. The old owner had passed away but lived with severe dementia in this house. Shortly after moving in, I would catch quick corner-of-the-eye glimpses of a black cat prancing along the floor. None of us owned cats. I kept it to myself for a bit until one of my roommates mentioned hearing weird things in the house when she was alone, so I mentioned the black cat. A few days after this, her mother was helping move stuff in with us. While carrying stuff inside, she suddenly jumped and exclaimed how she could have sworn she stepped on a cat's tail. Obviously there was no cat, and she knew nothing of my sightings before this. Last night a friend who also knew nothing of these 2 encounters said he seen a black cat walk across my bed, but brushed it off as seeing things. I told him of the other events, and it thoroughly freaked him out. He was covered in goosebumps and kept saying he felt as if he was being watched very intently. I personally believe it is a true spirit, perhaps the companion of the lady who used to live here. I intend on asking my landlord if she maybe owned a cat, but that's a stretch. There are also odd electrical mishaps, such as smoke detectors randomly beeping, even with proper maintenance and use just for them to randomly stop when my landlord would leave the house. He's the son of the lady who used to live here. I also sleptwalked for the first time in my life the other night. Strange stuff indeed, but I do not feel threatened or scared by this cat, but rather guarded. There's also a real white cat that stops by the backyard every now and then. My father was a farmer. He taught me how to hunt, how to use a gun, and most importantly, how to understand animals. We grew up poor. Everyone in our community did. People are different where I come from. More superstitious, more in touch with the land we called home. I shot my first deer at 11 years old. I watched it be skinned, gutted, and cut up for meat. We ate a lot of deer stew that winter. I will never forget the steam coming off of the dead doe's body as it was hung by its hind legs in the old barn that chilly night in late November. I reached inside its lifeless body and pulled out the heart. Thought it'd be cool to play with. Dad was proud. I shot that deer dead in its tracks. I walked out into the field that night, shaking from excitement, and reveled in my accomplishment. Miles from anywhere, alone but calm, I located the deer I shot. Its black eyes stared back at me. I took a life. The years passed. I grew up, graduated college, and mostly forgot about my childhood as a small-town girl. But my boyfriend always wanted to shoot a deer. He was jealous I had killed one at such a young age. People from wealthy suburbia always wanted to experience a taste of country life. So I decided to take him out on my land, hoping that he'd have the same experience I had as a child. Off we went to my family's old farm. I sat in a stand attached to an old oak tree, a few hundred yards away from my boyfriend's. I couldn't see him, but I knew exactly where he was perched. And now we waited. I fell asleep in the stand, but the coolness of the approaching night woke me as the sun faded below the pines. It was nearly dark, the exact time deer come out to eat. I looked up and saw nothing. At first I was disappointed, but regardless of the hunt, I enjoyed my time away from the chaos of civilization. It was peaceful and beautiful. You were someone different out here. I was about to call it a day, climb down from the stand, and go fetch my boyfriend from his station at the opposite side of our grassy field. But I felt something watching me. I hadn't moved yet, careful not to scare away any potential deer. I turned my head slowly. I saw black eyes at the edge of the field near the pines. I was silently ecstatic. I wanted the figure to come out into the open so my boyfriend can get a clear shot. Here's his chance. Only a few moments left to shoot his first deer before total darkness. A couple minutes had gone by, and the only light now was from the full moon rising. Our small window of time had passed. Shooting a deer now would be too dangerous. You don't want to risk a gut shot and a deer running off to an agonizing death. I looked closer at the edge of the woods. The figure didn't move like a deer, but it had the same black eyes. Actually, it barely moved at all. Might as well climb down from the stand, I thought, and the deer would surely run off once I moved. A moment later, I heard rustling that I assumed was the strange deer running into the woods. I turned to locate the sound. I turned, and its eyes creeped closer. It wasn't an animal I recognized. This was no deer. It was watching me, and chills ran over my body. It hobbled like a mutated human, dragging one leg behind. It was a small figure, maybe 4 feet tall. It was hobbling on all fours straight toward me. Faster, faster. Its eyes reflected in the moonlight. Its thin-skinned, skeletal body was gaining ground, and I was in its crosshairs. 2 seconds passed. I was confused and amazed, but felt safer in the stand 20 feet above the ground. This was my farm. What bad thing could happen? It took a diagonal path across the field to reach me. Now I was frozen in terror and amazement. It ran right below me, its black eyes staring up the tree where I sat. Bang! A shot rang out from my boyfriend's rifle. The figure leapt, disappeared into the woods. I nearly fell from my stand in terror. Those eyes, that body. It could not be real. What did I see? 2 minutes later, my boyfriend ran over. Did I get it? Where's the deer? Did you see? It was 20 feet in front of your stand. My face was frozen. I could not explain what happened. My boyfriend would never believe me. He left the field disappointed, and I left mortified. We trekked back to the farmhouse where my father was waiting. Hours later, and too traumatized to sleep, I was alone with my dad and told him what I had witnessed. His face had a slight look of surprise, but not disbelief. Then he sat me down and told me a story his father told him, the story of the figure in the woods. My best friend's sister passed away due to illness and bizarre complications when we were all in high school. The house they lived in had always scared us, but we tried to ignore it now for the most part. However, I can't ignore tonight. I walked into my friend's room and saw a terrifying, distorted girl who looked similar to her sister sitting on her bed. She was staring right at me, then she was gone. It makes me uncomfortable even writing it down. If it makes a difference, I have actually spoken to her sister twice in dreams, and she always seemed happy, healthy, and assuring. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to scare my friend, as then later out of nowhere she mentioned that she thinks her sister has visited her from little signs like lights flickering and things here and there. I didn't know if any of this amounts to anything, but I am severely shaken and freaked out. Is there any explanation for this? So a couple of years back, I was staying with my mom in this fairly haunted place. It wasn't too bad, but definitely some weird shit happened while we were there. We would go ghost hunting a lot during the summer, have some interesting stuff happen, but nothing stood out quite as much as this experience. A little backstory. My mom, good guy friend, and I had gone ghost hunting in an old abandoned house. The whole place was set up pretty weird, and we got some interesting things on recording. My mom got scratch marks on her back. Now this whole experience is a story for a different time. What's important to note is that while there, we had found an old tin filled with photographs, a real silver spoon, and a Victorian-style brooch. I had commented about how much I loved the brooch to my mom, but following ghost hunting common sense, left the brooch in the tin where we had found it. Fast forward a few hours later. We're now home, and I'm going to shower, and in my pocket is that damn brooch. We had tried everything to get rid of it, but it would always appear back in the house in the most random places. The activity in the house increased tenfold. Eventually, my mom buried the brooch outside and placed protective crystals around the outside of the house. We didn't see it again. Now, it was a super dry summer, not uncommon for South Texas, so when my best friend Nala and I heard a loud thunderstorm started outside in the middle of the night, we got super excited. Since we were home alone that night, we quickly threw on our shoes and bolted outside, dancing and laughing in the heavy rain. It was a lot of fun, till suddenly I felt pure fear start pumping through my veins. My attention immediately snapped to where the brooch was buried. At the same time, a flash of lightning lit up the whole yard. I mean, it looked like daylight outside for those few seconds. Standing there, I saw a thick black shadow man with what looked like a top hat. It's so hard to explain the exact feeling, but I knew I had to get inside that very moment. I immediately started running for the front door. I vaguely heard Nala running very close on my heels. We were struggling to get the door open. For some reason, it just would not budge. Eventually, we both managed to push the door open, slam it shut, and lock it. We turned to each other at the same time and spoke, "Did you see that? Did you hear that?" Both confused and a little terrified, we explained what we had both meant. I told Nala about how I saw the shadow man. She had not seen him. Instead, she had heard. At the same time, I saw the man, a loud, inhuman growl right next to her ear. Keep in mind I hadn't heard anything, and the thunder, or the lightning strike, had sounded while we were running back to the house. This was not my worst experience, but definitely in the top 3. I will never forget that raw fear I felt, nor can I ever fully explain it. It was like my life was in danger. It all started when I was a little girl. I saw a black mist, and it formed into the shape of a wolf/dog. Let's call it a wolf. It has 2 red eyes with a red aura about it. I wasn't scared. I had a calm feeling come over me. Days later, my grandma's sister passed. I was too young to make the connection. Fast forward to the day I actually died and came back. I was in the hospital for over a week, stabilizing from a stroke. I was 21 years old. When I came home, I woke up feeling an energy bursting inside my body. I opened my eyes and looked around my room, and I saw the wolf sitting on my dresser, looking at me for a good long moment before it jumped across my room and into a black tunnel. The tunnel closed behind it. I wonder if it was checking on me. In 2016, I was awakened, and I saw it above me in an orb form. A black misty orb with a red aura. I tried to shoo it away because I was annoyed to see it again. I got an image of my grandma. Days later, she passed. 2018, I saw it again in its wolf form in my dream this time. 2 days later, my 16-year-old cat was ready to pass away. He was suffering that day. I took him to the vet and held him as they put him to sleep. I get the sense that this might be a family guardian, but it appears to me in a wolf form because it's one of my favorite animals. I think it's telling me so I can spend time with that family member before they pass. I always get the image of the person who will pass before the wolf leaves. I assume that family guardians appear in all types that connect to the person who is seeking it. I wish I could tell my dad about it. Telling my mom is out of the question. But I just want someone to believe me when I tell them to be careful when I see it. My uncle used to be a guard at HM Dartmoor prison. Every time he visited me and my parents, he'd regale me with stories of his time at one of the UK's toughest correctional facilities, specifically the weird things that would happen that no one could explain, much to my mother's annoyance. There was always one story that fazed him. One you could see he was genuinely uncomfortable telling, so wouldn't, and it was only when I was a lot older that he actually revealed to me the whole truth of what had happened. Back in the 90s, the prison's conditions were terrible, infamously so. Overcrowding, riots, and poor food added to an already horrific working environment, and this sometimes led to breakdowns in the inmates' mental states and a lot of conflict. One particular inmate had this habit of screaming in the dead of night. When my uncle and the guards would investigate, he'd spew some nonsense about something outside in the woods that his cell window overlooked. He'd insist that something would talk to him from the darkness, something old and evil. It would say horrible, unspeakable things about him and his past that no one else could know, and would try to convince him to hurt others. It promised him his freedom if he did, but terrible things if he didn't. He also claimed he could see it watching him because of the eyes. My uncle and the others would never pay what he said much attention, as prisoners would often say anything to try and scare not only the other prisoners, but the guards too. Some were even renowned for trying to claim the insanity card to get relocated to cushier cells and comforts in psychiatric prison. One such time, my uncle was working a night shift. Generally a quiet, peaceful time to be working, as the majority of the prisoners were asleep, and the extent of his job required him to do certain patrols, which took him outside, something he had particularly enjoyed, as the inside of the prison at night always spooked him. That night, whilst patrolling an interior fence, he heard noises which seemed to come from the woods, which lined the perimeter of the prison. Stick snapping and owl calls were something he witnessed often due to Dartmoor's natural wildlife, but the snaps he heard that night were accompanied by deep growls. Ever vigilant, my uncle used his flashlight to look out to where the noises were coming from, to see if he could better make out what it was. It was total darkness, and he could just make out the trees in front of him. After a couple of minutes of looking, the noises stopped. Assuming it was an animal of some kind, he continued his patrol, but the noise started up again, and worse still, appeared to follow him. It was obvious to him now that it wasn't an animal, as only deer, foxes, and the odd rabbit inhabited the surrounding area, and whatever was making the commotion was a lot bigger than a doe or a stag, and these particular animals don't make the sound he was hearing. The constant rustling of bushes made him uneasy, so he stopped, pierced the darkness with his flashlight once more, and called out, "Whoever's there, you're in serious trouble if you don't show yourself. This is a high-security area, and trespassers will be prosecuted." Kids were known to drive around on the moors and dare each other to see how close they could get to the prison, but my uncle knew that this wasn't the case this time. It felt different. The air felt sinister, and he was already agitated and apprehensive. He paused for a while and listened, adamant that only an idiot would continue to hide. After another couple of minutes of silence, he radioed for another guard to come out and assist in finding out what was making these noises. It was a prison after all, and an escape attempt wasn't too crazy of an idea. Another guard appeared from inside the prison, and my uncle briefed him on what had happened. In the midst of explaining the growl that had specifically troubled him, it happened again, this time with his friend present. Sure in themselves that this wasn't an escape attempt, and could be something far more interesting, they shone both their flashlights into the dark, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. Now at this time there were legends of the beast of Dartmoor, a black cat-like animal that had been spotted on the wilds of Dartmoor, and had been attributed to various livestock deaths. Most of the stories had come from farmers and old people that lived by themselves in the middle of the moors, so their tales weren't worth their weight in salt, but at the moment both guards heard the noise. The stories weren't seeming that far-fetched. The volume of duration of the growling increased, and at this point my uncle and his friends were sure that whatever this wasn't native to the UK. There was a zoo nearby after all, but they were resolute in catching it and living forever as the men who caught the beast of Dartmoor. In the middle of discussing their plan, the rustling and growling stopped, and strangely and abruptly as it had begun, the men peered through the chain-link fence and waited, almost disappointed that they'd missed their opportunity for greatness when, out of the darkness, something flew over the fence and hit my uncle square in the chest, so hard that it knocked him off his feet. His friend picked him up, and they surveyed the area to see what had hit him. There, laying only a few inches away on the ground, was the head of a sheep. It had been desecrated. Its tongue and one of its eyes had been removed, and it looked like it had been gnawed on. Anyone in their right mind would have found this disturbing enough, but what happened next caused my uncle and his friend to rethink the peaceful positives of the night. My uncle swears on his life no less that when they looked in the direction the head had come from, in the darkness of the woods, they saw two piercing red eyes staring back at them. It was accompanied by a muffled, menacing laughter, almost like a gravelly chuckle, like whatever had thrown the head was pleased at the terror it had caused. In the blink of an eye, my uncle and his friend bolted for the comfort of the prison. My uncle sees the irony in that statement. None of their colleagues believed them, but an inmate, the one infamous for his late-night screams, overheard their conversation in the corridor from his cell and confirmed what they'd said and seen with great pleasure. After giving each other the heebie-jeebies from discussing what it could have been, the guards continued their shift, but remained alert. They always went in pairs during the outside patrol from that night onward. They didn't believe the stories completely, but enough to be too scared to do it alone. A few weeks later, my uncle and another guard, the one that joined him the original night, were patrolling the fence again when they heard the growl. They looked in its direction, and sure enough, something was in the darkness looking back at them, with the same piercing red eyes. They couldn't make out details of the figure, though. He described it as like looking at a silhouette in the night. Whatever it was, its form was darker than the infinite black of the woods surrounding it. To this day he swears blind that as their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they saw the inmate that corroborated their story standing next to it. Seeing his face eerily smiling back at them snapped them back into reality, and they radioed a break out across all channels in the prison. Alarms immediately sounded, and spotlights lit up the area surrounding the prison, but the dark shape and the prisoner were gone. They raced to his cell to confirm his escape, only to find the inmate. He'd hung himself using bits and pieces he had smuggled out of wood class. They saw he'd left a note. It read, "To my family, I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but it wouldn't leave me be. I hope I find peace." My uncle and his friend looked at each other and knew that he hadn't found peace. It seemed he'd been victim to something much, much worse, something that kept its promise of freedom, but nothing like the inmate had imagined. My uncle only told me that story once, but he never had to tell me it again. The thought of those red eyes piercing in the darkness will stay with me forever, and whenever I drive around on Dartmoor, the doors in my car stay locked.